All right, we are now going to discover Emmanuel Levinas. Yes, I will speak about the lecture video in a second, at the end of class when everyone is here. So let's begin with Levinas. I'll give you a brief introduction to his work. So here's the outline. We'll first talk about post-Holocaust thought. Number 2, his biography. Number 3, the text that we're studying, Enigma and Phenomenon. 2 sections. First one, we'll talk about the problem of the hidden God, and small b, we'll talk about ethics as a mode of approach to God. That's the plan for today. Okay, so Marcel, remember, was World War I. Now we're entering, for the last 2 philosophers, they are thinkers that were, doing their thinking during World War II. So it's a different picture, right? World War II is a lot worse than World War I because precisely of the genocide that took place in World War II, the 6 million Jews and countless gypsies and other people who were massacred during the Nazi regime. So we are in that context, right? And with Levinas, we are at the center of it because he is himself a survivor of the Holocaust, right? And we'll talk more about that in a second. So first of all, let's talk a little bit about the Holocaust and the impact it had on the philosophy of religion, because obviously it would have a huge impact. So first of all, you all know, of course, what happened, right? You've learned it in school, the 6 million Jews that were exterminated in the camps during the Nazi era. And as people start to come out of the camps, emerge from this tragedy, what did not come out of the camps the same was the concept of God, right? In other words, this tragedy, this trauma in the psyche, not only of Europe, but of the Jewish consciousness, made one question, right? Who really is God, right? There's the main question that arises after the Holocaust is obviously, where was God, right? How could he make this, allow this? But then there's a secondary question that if God was there, who is he, right? So there's a confusion after the Holocaust as to who God really is. We must have misunderstood. We thought that God was someone who would save his people, who would protect us in the days of trouble, who would stretch out his right hand and help us through, and nothing, right? Nothing. There's a famous song that was sung in the ghetto of, I think, Vilna. This is in Poland, I think, called the Partisan Song. Let me spell partisan right. Right, and in this, so this was a song sung in Yiddish. It was composed by Jews who were already segregated on their way to the camps, right? And this song talks about the skies being like lead, right? Let me write down, right, lead, which is a kind of very impermeable metal, right? You can't go through lead. And so this was kind of illustrating the sense that the Jews had at the time, that the sky was impenetrable. You could pray all you wanted, you could call out to God all you wanted, the sky remained like lead, impenetrable to the prayers and the supplications. And this is the context, right? So there is a huge debate if you haven't lost your faith, you are now caught up in this debate of, if God was there, if there is really a God, who is he, right? So we know from medieval thought that God, and most of us are familiar with this definition, God is both all-loving, right, and all-powerful, right? We are used to hearing these definitions of God, that God is both all-loving, all-powerful, and there's a third one, all-knowing, right? Most of us have come across these definitions of God. If it's not all-knowing, all-loving, all-powerful, it's not God, right? Now, the problem after the Holocaust is that we can't put these attributes don't fit together anymore, right? In other words, if you're all-loving and all-powerful, you can't have allowed the Holocaust. Either you are not all-loving, but you're all-powerful, so you could do something about it, but you chose not to, which means you're not all-loving, right? That's the first option, right? Let me say it again. Either you're all-powerful and you could have stopped it, but you choose not to, well, that tells me that you are not all loving. So God cannot be both, or he's all loving and therefore must have wanted to put a stop to it, but couldn't. So he's not therefore all powerful. So the two concepts, all loving and all powerful, it doesn't seem, you can't think them together anymore after the Holocaust. Does everybody follow what I just did? So put your hand up if you see what I'm saying, right? You can't have both together. Either God is all loving and he's not all powerful, or he's all powerful and he's not all loving, right? Book of Job, by the way, gives an interesting twist on this, right? We see a God who might not be all powerful since he's allowing the devil, right? Or you could say simply the world to take its course, right? As Maimonides would say, God creates, but then there's free will, right? So he's not all powerful because of that, because of free will. Or God is not loving in the sense we thought, right? We think of loving as protective, comforting, but maybe there are ways to love that are more challenging. So Job, kind of, the book of Job already starts to address this dilemma. But in any case, after the Holocaust, we are really caught up in this terrible question of, number one, is there a God? Where was God? And number two, if there was a God, who is he, right? So there's a very interesting story that is told around that time about this this enormous doubt about the existence of God that arose in the camps, right? As the Jews were witnessing, right, the decimation of women, children, and so forth, the question naturally, spontaneously arises, where is God in all of this? And Elie Wiesel tells a story about this question. Elie Wiesel, who hopefully you have read at least his famous book, The Night, right? Elie Wiesel is a New Yorker, actually, right? Or was he? I think he was between Boston and New York, right? But he had a home here in New York. So Elie Wiesel survived Auschwitz, right? Which is the worst camp. Most of his family was destroyed in the camp. He survives, and he ends up becoming a novelist, right? After 10 years of silence, where he is not able to express what he has seen, he begins to write, right? And the Holocaust is everywhere in his writings. And so he has several kind of novels, but the autobiographical novel, which you should all read at some point, is The Night, where he talks about his own experience. And in that particular novel, he describes a very tragic situation. So he's in Auschwitz, which is the worst concentration camp. And there was a tradition in Auschwitz where every morning you would have a kind of execution of whoever during the night had, committed a mistake, tried to escape, stolen something. You would execute them in the morning in front of everybody. So all the prisoners were brought out, they were lined up, and you would see there the gallows, and you would have the people who were to be executed that day. That particular morning, there were two men and a child who were supposed to be executed. The child was in the middle, and then the two men framed him, and they were to be executed on the gallows, hung, right? And the problem was that the child's body was too light, so the rope caught his neck, but he couldn't die because his body wasn't heavy enough to cause the strangulation. So he was kind of, between life and death for several minutes, and everybody had to watch this. And at one point, Elie Wiesel hears next to him somebody mutter, where is God, right? Where is God in this mess? And at that moment, Elie Wiesel writes, he heard within himself, right? Where is God? God is there in that child, between life and death, hanging between life and death. This is such a powerful revelation, because this is really what happened during the Holocaust. It is as though not only the Jews were being killed, but God himself, or the presence of God in the world, was hanging between life and death. It is as though God was almost wiped out, right? Not only the Jewish people were wiped out, but God himself, the presence of God, the concept of God as we know it, was being wiped out at that moment, along with the Jewish people, right? So we have, this is really the context, right? This is the trauma that has marked Europe still, that has marked the Jewish psyche, and that marked all of the survivors, right? So people come out of this and they have these questions that they can't resolve. And even Elie Wiesel, who was very pious, boy, when he entered the camp, he tells in the story how he used to be. He comes out and he just can't believe anymore. He can't do it. He has, you know, elements left within himself, but something is broken, right? If you've met Elie Wiesel, you can sense that in the person, right? There is something in that character that never healed, right? There's something that was broken between him and God that never healed, and this is the issue. And Levinas, of course, we'll see in the biography, has similar, not so bad experience, but also an experience at the hands of the Nazis. And he will, basically his whole philosophy will be an attempt to respond to this question, right? Where was God? At least his philosophy of religion, right? Where was God? And if he was around, who is he, right? So we'll talk about this in a second, right? How he tries to respond, how he will attempt to give an answer to this question. Okay, so let's go briefly into his biography so you have an idea more about his experience and how his vision of God was also shattered, right, by the Holocaust. So let me give you the elements. He was born in 1906 and he died in 1995. Okay. So he was born in Lithuania, and his family were kind of middle class, assimilated Jews, right? Most Jews were at the time over there in Lithuania. And he went to kind of Russian schools, he spoke Russian, and we can sense that because in many of his works, he's quoting actually famous Russian authors like Dostoevsky, so he's fluent. They moved briefly to the Ukraine, come back. There's a lot of anti-Semitism in these regions, so they're constantly on the move. In 1923, Levinas, attracted, right, by the secular spirit of France, moves there, right? France at the time is well known for not tolerating any type of discrimination or any type of religion, you know, religious intolerance, right? So it's an attractive place, secular, right? So he goes there and he begins to study philosophy, right? So he studies, he gets his degree, he begins to teach, and shortly after he's enlisted for the war, World War II in 1939. And he almost immediately, with his luck, he gets captured by the Nazis, right? Now, he is lucky because he's an officer in the army, so he doesn't get sent right away to a concentration camp. He's first a prisoner of war, and under the international law, they can't touch him, right? He's wearing the uniform, so he's spared actually the worst, right? He's just in a work camp along with others. And but this experience will profoundly shift and form his philosophical worldview. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about his experience, about the way he talks about it, right? There is a very famous essay that he wrote called "In the Name of a Dog." It's just, it doesn't work in English. It's in France, it's a pun. In French, I mean, is there, let me turn to my Spanish speakers. Do you have maybe something similar? We have an expression in French, nom d'un chien, which is in the name of a dog, which means basically shit, like nom d'un chien, right? That's what we say when we're like, want to curse, right? Do you have something similar in Spanish? Do you know, anybody? No, okay, so anyways, it's a pun. It's basically, so it's a pun, meaning, you know, like, damn, you know, but at the same time, it's a story about a dog. So I'm going to tell you a little bit this, and this is a story which profoundly moved Levinas, happened to him. So here's the story. So every day, right, the prisoners are led outside of the camp. They're supposed to be doing work on railroads or trenches or whatever. And they notice that as they're walking through different villages to get to their destinations, they notice that the people there just refuse to look at them. They're walking by and they kind of just turn their faces like they're not there. They kind of as though they're ashamed to look at them in the eyes, right? So this happens over and over again. And at the end, Levinas, as well as his companions, they get really sick and tired of this attitude, right? They're starting to feel like they're not human, right? They feel more and more dehumanized. It's not just the work and the difficulties of the camp, it's the attitude of civilian population right? Which refuses to even look at them, right? So they start to feel more and more dehumanized, and until one day, they enter the camp one day and they somehow don't close the doors right away, and a stray dog walks in. Right, so now let me ask you, how many of you are dog lovers? And you'll immediately understand. Any dog lovers in the class? Okay, two dog lovers. Okay, so if you're familiar with dogs, as soon as they see a human being, they're overjoyed. And so this dog, walks in the camp, starts leaping and bounding and jumping on everybody, so happy, wagging his tail. And at that moment, Levinas looking at the dog, realizes the dog is the only being who still sees me as a human being. Right? He's reacting towards me as he would react to another human being. And at that moment, he realizes the dog is the only being in the whole Germany where they were, right, captured, who still recognizes their humanity. Right? And so as a joke, he calls the dog the last Kantian of Germany. So if you know Kant, Emmanuel Kant, this is a philosopher in Germany, who spoke a lot about morality and respecting human beings and not abusing them. And so clearly in Germany, there's not a single Kantian left, right? So nobody believes, right, in the dignity of other human beings anymore except the dog, right? So this was a turning point for Levinas, right? This moment of feeling so dehumanized and feeling ignored and people turning their gaze away to not see him, really influenced his thinking. And so he begins to write already in the camps. I think he's there a few years, if I understood correctly. But when he's freed, he will begin to focus his entire philosophy on the concept of the other, right? Or the stranger, right? Because he himself now has felt in his own flesh what it's like to be the other, the stranger, the one that doesn't matter, right? The minority, the marginal, the refugee, right? And he begins to ponder, right? How is it, now this is really important, right? How is it, he ponders, that civilized nation like Europe could become so barbaric when it comes to the treatment of the non-citizen, of the other, of the stranger? Still today, by the way, right? If you look at the Western nations, they're very civilized when it comes to their own citizens. When it comes to the others, the immigrants, the refugees, there is nothing, right? There is nothing, it's gone. All the great grand ideals, right, of modernity don't apply, it seems, to those who are not citizens, right? They are not only ignored, but rejected, pushed back. In our country, they're put in cages, right? So there's a huge issue. How is it that civilized nations are great to, well, more or less, to their own, but when it comes to the other, have not a single feeling towards that being? So he begins to think about, why is it the case that it's like that? And he traces the roots of this indifference, right, to the other, to Western philosophy. And this is very interesting because he traces the roots to Descartes, Cartesian philosophy. So I'm going to talk briefly about Descartes because it's interesting to see how Western philosophy, how it has grown in a certain direction, which created this indifference, right? So I'll just give you a brief summary of Descartes. Descartes is a French philosopher of the 17th century, who is considered the father of, modern Western philosophy, right? And anybody, let me just see how many of you are familiar with Descartes. Anybody studied Descartes in the class? Okay, so like 3 of you. Okay. Okay, like 5. Good. I'm relieved. Okay. So Descartes, what is the famous quote by Descartes? Anybody remember?
I think that therefore I am.
Very good. I think therefore I am, right? So this is how Descartes came to this very famous quote or conclusion. He one day sat down and he decided, I am not sure about anything, which is true. We're not sure, right? Everything could be a big dream. So he started to wonder, how can I be certain that what I am seeing is actually real, right? This is the dilemma of the Matrix, by the way. If you saw the Matrix, same issue, right? So he thinks, well, let me figure out if there's one thing I can be certain. And he realizes, yes, there's one thing I can be certain. And it's that I am, that I am doing the doubting, that there is an I, right? An ego that is doing this doubting and this pondering and this questioning whether everything is real or not. So he realizes, well, there is one reality for sure, and it's the reality of myself, right? The ego. And so hence the quote, I think, therefore I am, right? So the fact that he's thinking, he realizes, well, these thoughts need a self who is doing the thinking. And so he discovers the first founding principle to be the only thing I can be sure of in this life is that there is a self that is doing the thinking. Right now, whether the self has a body, I'm not sure, but I know there's something that exists that is doing the thinking, right? And then from there on, he will rebuild the whole world, right? He will rebuild the existence of God, the physical reality. And now this is interesting. He will rebuild the concept of the other. Now watch how he does it. This is crucial to understand the Western mindset when it comes to refugees and immigrants and so forth. Here's how Descartes does this. This is in the, I think it's in the Metaphysical Meditations. He says, okay, I look at the other and I'm not sure if he's a human being until I realize, because I can't have access to his soul. I don't know if he has a soul like me, right? But I notice that this other has similar bodily behavior as me. He's smiling, he's crying, he's walking around, he's running away when he's afraid. So then I deduce that, like me, he must have a soul. Right now, notice the argument. This is fascinating. What makes the other human, according to Descartes? Let me ask you, let me see if you caught it. What gives them the dignity of being human, according to Descartes, according to what I just said? Anyone catch it? Excellent, Bella, right? The other is human because in as much as he resembles me. This is the moment of perversion, right, in Western thought. If the other is human because he resembles you, what about the others who don't resemble you? Does that mean they're not human? And this is where the West has gone, right? From colonialism to slavery to imperialism to Nazism, it's always the same reasoning. The other is human only in as much as they resemble me. If they don't resemble me, I have a doubt. I can't be sure. And so for centuries, we have thought that, right, African nations, because they don't act the same, they don't have a soul. Indians don't have a soul. Let's see, the Jews, right, they're different, don't have a, likewise, right? So this is the moment that Western thought made the wrong turn, right, with Descartes in a way, right? And so we are now in a worldview in Western thought that the only people who have the dignity of being human or civilized are people who are like us. And if they're not like us, either they are primitive and barbaric, or we must make them like us. And if they refuse to fit in the category, we are not going to give them the dignity of being human. And this is exactly what the West has been doing since the 17th century, through all of the way that they have treated the other, whether it's the other of the race, or the other of indigenous, right, communities, or the other of even the woman. Anytime didn't fit, didn't look like, didn't resemble the Western subject, inferior, barbaric, needs to be dominated, needs to be civilized, needs to be assimilated. And so we get to the culmination of this attitude during the Nazi era, right? Where we have this perennial other, this Jew who will never integrate, right? And doesn't look like us, doesn't act like us, not the same God, and therefore doesn't deserve the dignity, right, of human, of being a human at the same degree as us, right? And this is it. So Levinas is realizing the main issue of Western thought is really what he calls a deep, pervasive allergy to the other, right? He actually uses that expression. He says the problem of Western thought, the illness, the sickness of Western thought, is that it is deeply allergic to any type of other. Everything has to always fit, resemble it, and if it doesn't resemble it, it's going to be either exterminated or assimilated. Those are the two ways that the West has approached its other. It either exterminates or it assimilates or civilizes, to put it nicely. right? And this is due to this original sin that Descartes made when he decided that everything starts with the self, and that the self will determine who is a human being based on itself, right? And yes, of course, same thing, right? Colonization is the assimilation. I make you like me. Or if you're not going to refuse to be colonized, I will exterminate you, right? This is the issue, right? So Levinas is really offering a powerful critique of Western thought in general, right? And showing that it has a huge blind spot, a pathological blind spot. It is not even aware of the other. And this is why, says Levinas, when we were being herded through these villages as others, people didn't even notice, right? We don't belong to the category of human because we are others, right? In the mind of the West, if you're an other, you're a subhuman. Everything has to be like the self. If it doesn't fit, you don't deserve my pity, you don't deserve my compassion, and so forth, right? And we have this, of course, here in the United States, same mindset, right? We have this notion that if you're not if you don't look like the founding fathers of America, you're probably, a little off, a little inferior, and it doesn't matter if you die, right? It's not a big loss, right? Same idea, right? That if you're not like me, you don't have the same status, you don't have the same dignity as a human being. It's pervasive, right? It's everywhere. Okay, so Levinas's goal, really his whole philosophy, is going to be basically an attempt to awaken the Western psyche to the central importance of the other. The goal of his philosophy is to awaken the West to the importance of the other, to awaken them to the other, period. And to show that the other is necessary for the self, right? So this is really in general his philosophy, right? What we're going to be reading is more his philosophy of religion. It's a little different, but you will find these concepts again. They're everywhere. Okay, so let's go to the text we're going to read, Enigma and Phenomenon. Let me see. Okay, so Enigma and Phenomenon. So just warning you, this is one of the hardest texts in the whole history of philosophy. I'm just putting it out there so you know. This is even harder than Marcel, right? This is, Levinas, in my view, is just, I think he's one of the hardest philosophers to read, right? Yes, I'm doing it on purpose. But remember, right? The goal when you read is not to understand, it's always to just enjoy being in the presence of this great mind, right? So no need to be scared. I will explain everything. Okay, so Enigma and Phenomenon deals first and foremost with what I put in the outline, the problem of the hidden God, right? This is the starting point of this text, right? Levinas has come out of the Holocaust, right, along with his companions, and the question that dominates, right, the minds of people who have any type of religious sensibility left, because a lot of people just became atheists after the Holocaust. They were like, well, we're done here, right? But those who still had some religious sensibility left, the question that arises is where were you, right? Where was God, and who is he, and what's going on? And so Levinas is really responding to those people who are just plagued by questions and doubts, and who are tortured by this trauma of realizing that they thought they knew who God was, but now it's not who they expected, right? Or maybe doesn't even exist. So he begins actually on the question of doubt. And this is very powerful. He begins by saying that doubt is inherent to the spiritual journey. Actually, this is where he's making a huge contribution, right? So he starts with the doubt of his contemporaries, right? Everybody's doubting, everybody's questioning, everybody is traumatized, right? And with a masterful move, he reverses the issue, and he says, your doubt is the only path left to God. This is so powerful, right? He's basically saying, if you're in doubt, if you're grappling with this, if you're if you're confused, if you're anxious, if you're just going mad over this issue, he's saying you are actually on the only path left to the divine. There is no other path. The path of certainty has been shattered, right? The path of faith has been shattered because we had faith in God and nothing happened, right? We thought we knew God. We thought we had this, nothing, right? So the path of faith, the path of certainty, none of these survive, right? The Holocaust, the only path left. So he's doing something powerful, something which is supposed to put a barrier between us and God, our doubts, our questions, our anguish. He's saying this is actually not a barrier. This is access. This is in fact, the only point of access left. Now you should be seeing connections with Maimonides. Anybody see the connection with Maimonides? Can you tell me what it is?
Didn't he believe that we had to have our our material world sort of shattered and disturbed so that we would even seek out this spiritual or divine connection?
So that's Rumi, and that works too,
Oh.
yeah. So yes, but Levinas would never, I think, as a Jew, right, in the Jewish tradition, in the Maimonidean tradition, you would never see God as giving you suffering as a gift, because then you're implying that the Holocaust was a gift to the Jewish people, and that sounds terrible, right? So Levinas is not going to take the path of Rumi on that one. So try to remember Maimonides. It's a little different. Who remembers? Yes.
Well, he encouraged for you to question, right? He encouraged, that was one of the ways to connect, was through doubt, through questioning, not conforming to what you've been taught, like stepping out of your religion in order to learn about God, right? Learning the sciences and all that.
Exactly, right? So Maimonides, remembers, it encourages doubt, right? In fact, there's a section, we didn't read it together, but there's a section in the guide where he makes a hierarchy. And so I'll just tell you quickly the hierarchy because it's interesting. At the very bottom, he puts all the pagans, right? They're hopeless. Then he puts the religious pagans, so people who are of other religions. And then he goes to the believers who blindly follow. And then he has above the believers, the ones who question, right? So, and then finally on top are the ones who questioned and found answers, right? So this is the hierarchy. So if you're a believer, a simple believer who doesn't question, you're actually 3 steps lower, right? Then you're with the pagans, right? You're classified with the pagans. You're closer to the pagans than to the enlightened, right? Religious ones. The ones who doubt actually higher than you, because doubt is that which allows for broadening, remember, right? So Levinas is really situating himself in the line of Maimonides. This is not foreign to Jewish thinking, right? This idea that doubt is, except now for Levinas, he's going to actually say doubt is the only path left, right? We can't get. In fact, Levinas is not saying we can't get certainty. He's saying we shouldn't look for it anymore, right? Because to find certainty or even to find comfort, we'll talk about this when I do the lecture, is an insult to the victims. If you survive the Holocaust and then you kind of, find a comfortable spot somewhere where, you have a nice belief in God, a little altar, you are in a way betraying the victims who were not comforted, right? So we'll talk about that. So Levinas is actually refusing to take the last step that Maimonides was talking about, right? For Levinas, there can be no comfort. There can be no certainty, because to affirm certainty would be an insult, right, to the victim. So, but very similar still to Maimonides, right? So, right. So this first section, right, when you'll read it, you will see this element of doubt and the fact that this is actually an access, right, to God. And of course, he talks about a million other things at the same time, worse than Marcel. If you thought Marcel was a psychotic, Levinas is 10 times worse, right? So that's the first part that we'll do, right? So in a sense, this helps us understand the title. I'll talk about enigma, phenomenon, what they mean, but we already see that God in many ways for Levinas is meant to be accessed as an unknown, something we cannot know. because the doubt, right? And we'll see the connection with the title. So second part, right, ethics as a mode of approach to God, is now the only path left forward if you want to really connect to God, right? For Levinas, after the Holocaust, any type of relationship, right, vertical relationship you had with God or personal relationship you had with God is shattered because God didn't deliver. I was faithful, but where were you? Remember that Judaism is a covenant religion. It's a contract, right? I obey God and he has my back. That's the contract. That's the original contract that was made in the Hebrew Bible, right? So the Jews kept their part of the contract and God didn't deliver. We are now having a divorce, right? And this is how Judaism experienced it, right? It's a breach of contract. It's a trauma that cannot be forgiven. And many Jews felt that it was impossible to still maintain a personal connection when there had been such a deep betrayal, right? This is the equivalent. What happened in the Holocaust is the equivalent of what can happen in a marriage where your significant other cheats against you, right? Now they're back, right? And maybe they forgot a little bit the other person, but you can't do it, right? You can't do it like before. Right, you feel the betrayal is too deep, right? The trauma is too profound. It's even if you want to forgive, you can't, right? This is where we are after the Holocaust, right? Even if God comes back, even if the churches are rebuilt, the synagogues are rebuilt, the communities formed again, still the betrayal was too deep, right? So any type of personal relationship has been destroyed. Any possibility of a vertical personal relationship for Holocaust survivors is impossible, right? And so Levinas is going to do something very special, and I'm not going to tell you yet what he's going to do, but he's going to show an alternative route, right, back to God, which in a way acknowledges the breach, but yet still finds a way back to God. But for this, he will have to redefine who God is. And this is where things will get extremely interesting, right? Levinas is actually going to give a new definition of God, one that doesn't fit with all loving, all powerful, all knowing. And it's a new definition that will shock some of us, right? We will feel uncomfortable with this new definition. And yet, as he's talking about it, you can find resonances between what he will be saying and the Hebrew Bible. Hebrew Bible does support this shift in the perception that Levinas is going to make, right? So in a way, what Levinas is doing is leaving behind a concept of God and moving towards another way to understand God, right? So in a way, he's leaving behind this great God sitting on a throne, intervening in history, saying, no, we were wrong. There is no such God, right? But then you have to move towards another perspective on God. And this is what we will see, right? How he does that. I'll just say briefly, right? And then I will develop when we do the class. He's going to move from a powerful God to a weak God. He's going to move from a God who comforts us to a God that needs to be comforted. And we'll see how he does that, right? To a God who is the God of war, to a God who is in the victim. Right, so he's shifting radically the concept to its opposite almost. I mean, who can imagine a God who is weak? That's not a God, right? Or a God who needs to be comforted. That's not a God. Or a God who is vulnerable. This doesn't make sense to most of us who are used to thinking of God as a big warrior, fighting for us. It's so interesting, by the way, just a footnote. When you look at the Christian view of God, it resonates so deeply with what Levinas will be talking about. Of course, Levinas will never make the step into Christianity, right? But when you read some of the Levinasian descriptions of God, there are powerful parallels with the intuitions of Christianity, right? When you look at the Christ, right, who was himself oppressed, persecuted, victim, God is weak in the figure of Jesus, right? God needs comfort, right? When you watch the crucifixion and so forth. So there are I just had to say that there are interesting parallels, right, between the Christian vision of God in the figure of Jesus and what Levinas is going to talk about. And in fact, Levinas himself makes the bridge when he quotes Kierkegaard, right? Kierkegaard, of course, if you're familiar, is a Christian philosopher, and Levinas quotes him. So he is drawing from the Christian tradition to redefine God, of course, this time in a Jewish context, right? So I'm leaving you in suspense because we need to develop this, but you should already expect a complete reversal of what you have always known into something completely different, right? Okay, any questions so far? I'm putting gallery view. Any questions so far on what I said? Clarifications that you need? No, everybody cool? Okay. So last thing I'm gonna say is how to read Levinas. This is very important advice. Okay, so first I'll tell you my experience with Levinas. So when I was doing my bachelor's, I went to my advisor and I said I had to do a senior thesis, right? So I said, okay, I want to do a thesis on, I don't know, Jewish thought and existentialism. A very broad topic. Don't come to your advisor with a topic like that. And he said, okay, you should look into Levinas. I said, okay. So I got the big book, right, by Levinas called Totality and Infinity. It was Thanksgiving vacation. I went home, I read the whole book. I came back and he's like, okay, what did you think? I said, wow, I loved it. I loved it. I didn't understand a word, but I loved it. This is Levinas. His writing is so powerful and intoxicating. He's like a poet, but he's like, not like Rumi, who's like a nice stream of water. Levinas is a torrent. Do we have that word, torrent? Is that an English word? Anybody understand me when I'm saying torrent? Who understands me? Okay, great. So it is an English word. Okay. It's like a huge tidal wave, right? It's like, right? So you get caught up with the debris, right? But it's such a powerful ride, right? Levinas just intoxicates you, brings you places, even though you don't know where you're going, you still feel like you're going somewhere. So I have to say, first of all, Levinas's writing is very beautiful, but it's also very powerful. You can sense a very powerful breath of inspiration in his writing. Of all of the thinkers of the 20th century coming from France, and we have a lot, in my view, he's the only one doing serious philosophy. All of the others, if you're familiar, including Derrida, by the way, who is just, you know, the star here in the United States, all of them are playing. They're playing, and you know, with building blocks. They're not doing, in my view, serious philosophy. They're playing with words. They're playing with this notion of there's no meaning. It's the postmodern, right? No meaning, no truth. And they're like children in the recess, right? Levinas is part of that tradition of postmodernism where there is no truth, no meaning, but you can sense there is a powerful breath of inspiration. There is actual meaning in Levinas. There is, when you dig, you find. Whereas some of these other philosophers, you dig and there's nothing. Okay, now I made my, I destroyed my reputation. So yes, good question. How would I would define real philosophy, philosophy which genuinely seeks to bring, first of all, faces human suffering, and second of all, brings a path of navigation. That's for me real philosophy. If you're not facing human suffering, and if you're not helping me navigate it, don't do philosophy. I'm not interested in what you have to say, right? So for me, real philosophy is rooted in reality and is a response to reality. And it's a response which is supposed to help us navigate reality. And if you're not doing that, if you're just playing in your living room, right, and throwing words around, you're not doing real philosophy. There, that was my rant on 20th century French philosophy. Levinas, however, you can sense every word is coming from his guts, right? He's writing not from his head, but from not even his heart. He's writing from his guts. That's why it's so powerful. Have anybody of you ever listened to spoken word poetry? And this is a big New York thing. Y'all should be into this. Okay, good. Right. Levinas is the spoken word philosopher. He's not like Maimonides in the head. He's not like Rumi in the heart. He's coming from the guts, and you can sense it. And that's why it's so powerful, right? He's writing from his own substance. He's writing from a place of pain and suffering and reality. And he's writing, and it's like an explosion, right? Not only of the pain, but of trying to find an anchor, right? Of course, in Levinas, there's never any anchor, right? We are always reminded of the pain, right? Levinas's writing, unlike Marcel, Levinas's writing is the writing of someone who has been traumatized. You can sense there is a lot of pain in his writing, right? Especially the second book, Otherwise Than Being, right? That book is very, it's the book of a wounded psyche, right? So anyway, so when he's writing, you will be caught up by the authenticity of the voice, but you won't understand what he's saying. You might get a few moments, right, where you sense or you see a beautiful sentence and it feels meaningful, but it's very difficult to decipher Levinas for two reasons. So first of all, you get a sense, right? The way he writes, the tone, the power, writing from his guts, the beauty of the language that he's using is very poetic. But at the same time, it's hard to understand for two reasons. Okay, number one, when Levinas is writing, the whole Western tradition pouring through. It's as, you know how can I compare it to? You know when you haven't spoken for a while? Some of you are in quarantine, like, you know what that's like. Have you ever had a moment you haven't spoken for a while and then you meet a friend and you're just gushing? You can't stop speaking. And you're thinking of yourself, like, why am I speaking so much? Right? So Levinas, it feels like that. It feels like the explosion of a thought which has been repressed for too many years. And one day it just explodes, right? So everything comes out. Plato, Descartes, Descartes, Husserl, Heidegger, everybody's there, right? So if you don't know the whole history of philosophy, you don't know what he's alluding to. Because Levinas continuously in his works, remember, is in dialogue with Western philosophy. And he is in a critical dialogue. And so he's constantly bringing up these guys, right? Descartes, Plato are brought up a lot, Husserl, Heidegger, right? These are the main figures that he brings up over and over again to respond to them. Right? So if you're not familiar with what they did, you won't get, right, the insinuations or the allusions that he has to them. But there's a second reason why he writes the way he does, similar to Marcel. Levinas, remember, his goal is to awaken us to the concept or the presence of the other. His writing is already that encounter. In other words, he writes in a way that when you read it, you will feel, before understanding anything, that you're already in contact with otherness. He writes as the other. In other words, the other is usually the person we can't understand, can't grasp, mildly annoying, frustrating. This Levinas intentionally writes like an other, so that you can begin to rub shoulders, right, with otherness. To read Levinas is to experience firsthand what it's like to be with another. You don't understand, you don't grasp, you feel angry, you can't control, you're frustrated, you feel small. This is what it's like to be with a real other, not someone familiar. Familiar people, it's fine, we get along, but someone really different, you want to kill them, right? So Levinas, in a way, his writing is already putting us in the situation of an encounter with otherness. So before we even understand what he's saying, we are already experiencing otherness. And so the invitation, of course, is not to reject or try to understand or try to master, is simply to undergo, right? Let yourself be washed over. Just go along for the ride, enjoy it. Because to be honest, this is a good practice for when you will be with a significant other. If you don't learn now to kind of take things in stride, right, and always trying to control or understand, it's not going to work. You have to acknowledge at one point in a relationship that I'm never going to understand this. I don't have control over this. Let me just let go. We saw this with Marcel, right? Mystery. Learn to dwell in mystery rather than control, like a problem. Levinas is the same. To learn to dwell in the strange territory that the other puts us in. And in many relationships, of course, the people we fall in love with are similar, but they're also deeply different. And learning to dwell in that difference without trying to fix it, without trying to change it. This is what Levinas is teaching us, right? Learn to dwell in the discomfort of being with another. Why are you uncomfortable? Because you're wanting to fix. You won't be uncomfortable if you just relax and enjoy the otherness. Good advice. Okay. So these are the two reasons, right? First of all, you need to know all of philosophy to understand Levinas. And second of all, he is intentionally wanting to put us in an uncomfortable position of being in the presence of another. This is what it feels like. How are we reacting to that? Are we able to just welcome the otherness and go along and listen humbly to what they're trying to say? Or are we going to, be condescending and be like, what the hell, why isn't he clear? And, he should be clear, and want them to be like us, right? Or to make sense to us. So the degree to which you receive Levinas is the degree to which you're able to receive the others in your life. It's a test. I'm going to ask you on Monday, how many of you like Levinas? If you didn't like Levinas, you have a problem. You have a problem with otherness in general. That would be the diagnostic. Okay, that's it. Any questions on anything I said? No, very good. Let's see, what time is it? Oh, great. All right, so we have a few minutes, about 20 for the Martin Luther King. Let me stop the recording.